By the summer of 1942, the Second World War had been raging for almost 3 years and showed little sign of abating. The conflict that started back in 1939 when Nazi Germany invaded Poland had now spread far beyond the confines of Europe, and as the Axis powers sought to expand their vast empires, the battlefields of war stretched from Africa to Asia. With Germany, Italy and Japan now united against the Allies, fighting had broken out in every corner of the globe, and the struggle continued across the war-torn continents, while at sea, naval battles were being fought for control of supply routes. As the Axis tightened their stranglehold on the previously tranquil waters of the Mediterranean, there was an ever-growing risk that the Allies fighting in North Africa would be cut off. And the future of their Western Desert Offensive was far from assured. Italian and German troops were now posing a very real threat to British interests in Africa, as they struck deep into the desert landscape of Egypt, reaching El Alamein just outside Cairo. Within the shortest of time frames, there was little left standing between the Axis powers and the Suez Canal, which was the pathway to the oil fields of the Middle East. If the Allies were to stand any real chance of victory in World War II, the battles that lay ahead to secure North Africa would be absolutely critical. Ironically, though, the leader of Nazi Germany's attentions would not be entirely focused on North Africa. Adolf Hitler's determination to destroy communism proved to be rather stronger than his desire to penetrate Egypt. On the Eastern Front, as the German tanks rolled further into Russia, by July 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad was well underway. Facing a bitter conflict, Joseph Stalin, the Russian leader, called for a great patriotic war against the enemy, and with the full might of the Soviet Red Army to contend with, the troops of Hitler's Third Reich were destined to be occupied for some time to come. And all the while in the Far East, despite the immense territorial gains of Hitler's Japanese allies, the tide that had so far been running in the Axis favour was slowly beginning to turn against them. Out at sea, the Battle of Midway had proved to be a crucial victory for the Allies in the Pacific theatre of war. The Americans had caused irreparable damage to the fleet of Japan, spurring US soldiers on, who were now ready for their first offensive in the Solomon Islands. The African continent had been a field of conflict between Western empires long before the outbreak of the Second World War, and while European colonies were established across the continent, by the early 20th century there was little left that the native inhabitants could call their own. The last remaining independent states were the tiny Republic of Liberia to the west and the ancient Kingdom of Ethiopia to the east. But in the 1930s, when the climate in Europe became increasingly unsettled and new leaders hungry for power emerged, the autonomy of these countries would also be under threat. The Suez Canal was of great strategic importance as it connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, providing a pathway to the rich oil fields of the Middle East. It also provided the shortest ocean link between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, and had originally been important in helping the European powers govern their colonies. Malta was particularly important to the North African campaign, as it provided the only Allied base between Gibraltar and Egypt and was the last threat to Rommel's supply lines from Europe. The British Prime Minister Winston Churchill regarded the island an unsinkable aircraft carrier, of course, but as Rommel's troops made progress in Libya, beating back the Western Desert Force and heading eastwards towards Egypt, the Axis hold on the Mediterranean would tighten, and by 1942, almost no ships would be able to get through to Malta. Hitler and Mussolini lacked the resources to take both Cairo and Malta at the same time, so they decided to batter and starve the island into submission. It would become one of the most intensely bombed areas in the war, with around 250 raids per month in the first 6 months of 1942. The destruction to the island was unimaginable, and thousands of people were killed or injured in the attacks. Their devotion to the Allied cause, however, did not go unnoticed, and they were awarded the George Cross for their heroism, while the American President, Franklin D. Roosevelt, described the island as one tiny bright flame in the darkness. But while supplies dwindled and Allied naval forces struggled to reach Malta, Allied commanders realized it would only be a matter of time before the island surrendered. Rommel, in the meantime, was approaching Egypt, and after weeks of grueling battle, by June 20th, 1942, he had captured Tobruk. 10 days later, his panzers reached El Alamein, a railway station on the coast of Egypt, just 60 miles from Alexandria. While the Allied position deteriorated dramatically, Churchill refused to be beaten by Adolf Hitler and was adamant that the battle to crush the Axis should continue.
The day will come. It will come when British and American armies march into countries not as invaders but as liberators, and when from the soil that spring up in passionate hope and valiant effort the peoples who have been held down under a cruelest of barbarian yoke.
Though Churchill was determined to defeat Hitler, the British situation was by now critical. As well as Axis gains in Europe and Africa, there were grave concerns for the future of the British Empire in the Far East. Singapore had fallen, as had Burma, and the risk that the Japanese might venture across the border into India and attack from the east could not be ignored. Meanwhile, as the Germans progressed in Russia, closing in on the Caucasus, there was the possibility that new German armies might descend from the north through Iran. Adding to the threat posed by the Japanese and Rommel, this meant that British forces in the Middle East might have to face the enemy 3 ways. By the end of June 1942, in Egypt the panic was already setting in, and in Cairo the British began burning confidential papers anticipating the arrival of Rommel's troops any day. Meanwhile, all measures were taken to stall the enemy by flooding areas around the River Nile and building defensive positions to the west of Alexandria. Wavell, who had originally headed the Middle East Command, had by this time been replaced by Claude Auchinleck, who had previously commanded the Indian Army. Auchinleck had not seen much success since his appointment 1 year earlier, however, and was criticised for having little experience or understanding of British or Dominion troops. The Western Desert Force, which had by now changed its name to the 8th Army, was made up of divisions from around the British Empire, including South Africa, Australia, and India. The confidence that both Dominion and British commanders had in Auchinleck was waning by the summer of 1942, however, and relations were considerably strained. Nevertheless, the fate of Egypt now lay in their hands, and Auchinleck's future rested on their success. The Allied Desert Air Force would also play a prominent role in the defence of Egypt, and when Rommel began the attack on El Alamein on July 1, 1942, they would cause considerable damage to the advancing units. The RAF planes heavily bombarded the already fragile supply routes, and while British mobile columns attacked from the west and from the south, soon Rommel's men were exhausted and running out of supplies. By July 4th, the commander took the decision to go on the defensive, and the German advance was halted. For Churchill, it was not enough. He urged Auchinleck to attack again and to completely eliminate the Axis threat. But Rommel's defences held strong, and while battles continued throughout July, by the end of the month, the British commander had no choice but to end the offensive operations. The failure confronted Churchill at a particularly difficult time, for he was about to inform the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, that an Anglo-American invasion of Europe would not be possible until the African campaign had been concluded. Stalin had been fighting Nazi Germany since June 1941, and while the Russians struggled desperately to halt the advance of Hitler's troops, the Soviet leader had been putting pressure on Churchill to open up a second front for some time. While Stalin hoped for an invasion of occupied Europe, British commanders had, however, concluded that an Allied invasion of northwest Africa, where Vichy France held territory in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, should be the priority. This would improve naval control of the Mediterranean Sea and help pave the way for an invasion of southern Europe by 1943. Though the Americans were not as keen as their British counterparts, Roosevelt supported Churchill when he suggested the invasion of North Africa. Nevertheless, with Egypt still under threat, the Allied position in the region was tenuous to say the least. Wary that Stalin would be unhappy with the alternative arrangements, Churchill decided to stop off in Cairo on his way to Moscow in early August 1942, determined to make some changes to the Middle East Command. By now, there was a considerable breakdown of morale amongst those in the 8th Army, and with complaints circulating about Auchinleck, Churchill decided he should be replaced with General Harold Alexander. Alexander had a commendable track record, with awards for heroism spanning both the First and Second World Wars. But more importantly, he understood the importance of keeping spirits up amongst the troops and was much respected by the men he commanded. Together with Admiral Harwood, who remained in command of naval operations, and Arthur Tedder, who commanded Allied air operations, Alexander would now take the Allies into a new phase in the Western Desert Campaign. Meanwhile, there was also the leadership of the Eighth Army itself to be considered, which had been commanded more recently by Auchinleck himself. Churchill was keen that one of the Eighth Army Corps commanders, Lieutenant General William Gott, take on this role, but when the plane Gott was travelling in on his way to Cairo was shot down by a German fighter ace, Churchill was forced to rethink. Sir Alan Brooke, the Chief of Imperial General Staff, had initially recommended that Lieutenant General Montgomery, who had led troops in the Battle of France, should command the Eighth Army, and although Churchill had dismissed the suggestion earlier on, with the loss of Gott, it seems he was left with no choice. On August 7th, Montgomery took on his new role as leader of the Eighth Army, and his dedication to his troops and popularity amongst his men would help transform not only the army, but the fortunes of the Allies in Africa. Although the changes in the Middle East Command would certainly improve the Allies' chances, Churchill still had to confront Stalin with the news that Africa would take priority over Europe. He arrived in Moscow on August 12th to discuss the situation with the Soviet leader. But although Stalin initially argued for an attack on France, the British Prime Minister managed to reason with him. He explained that by taking North Africa, they could threaten the belly of Hitler's Europe by striking at Germany through Italy, and he assured the Soviet leader that in the meantime, American and Commonwealth forces would be assembled in Britain ready for the eventual invasion of France across the Channel. After days of discussions, Stalin eventually gave the invasion of Africa his blessing and assured Churchill that the Soviet troops could hold out until the winter. But as Churchill returned to London, the Nazis were already advancing on Stalingrad, and the Soviets were about to face their most difficult battle to date. When Adolf Hitler had ordered the invasion of the Soviet Union back in 1941, he had a number of strategic objectives, which included seizing Leningrad to the northwest of the country, Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union, to the center, and Stalingrad to the south. But as yet, the conquest of Russia was proving more difficult than the Nazi leader had expected. Although Hitler's troops had reached Leningrad by September 1941, those defending the city had refused to surrender, and the siege of Leningrad would continue for another 2.5 years. The Battle of Moscow, in the meantime, had come to a close in January 1942 and had been a decisive Soviet victory, although over 1 million Soviet soldiers and civilians had been taken prisoner or killed in the process. Having failed to capture Moscow or Leningrad, Hitler had now placed all his hopes on vanquishing the city which bore the name of the Soviet leader, Stalingrad. Stalingrad provided vital transport routes between the Caspian Sea and northern Russia, and seizing the city would effectively sever the transportation of supplies to the north. It was also hoped that the capture of Stalingrad would secure the right flank of the German armies as they advanced into the Caucasus, a region which was rich in oil and minerals and vital to Hitler's war against the Allies. But perhaps one of the greatest reasons Hitler had for attacking Stalingrad was its significance to the Soviet leader. Stalin had played a part in defending the city against the White Army in 1919, when the Red Army was battling for the survival of Bolshevism. But when he had come to power as leader of the communist nation in the 1920s, he had decided to change the city's name, which was originally Tsaritsyn, to Stalingrad, to celebrate his role in the Russian Revolution. Such symbolism was not lost on Adolf Hitler, but while the Nazi dictator was driven by his desire to destroy communism, his general staff wanted to attack in the direction of Moscow again, in the hope they could crush the remainder of the Soviet military forces. There was little hope of dissuading Hitler once his mind was made up, however, and the attack on Stalingrad and the Caucasus, codenamed Operation Blue, took priority over all other military plans and was scheduled to commence by the end of May 1942. In the meantime, the Soviets had been given a strong indication of the latest Nazi scheme. A briefcase containing the plans for Operation Blue had been discovered after a German plane was shot down over Russia. But while the Soviet generals pored over the papers, Stalin was convinced that the appearance of the plans were no more than a deliberate ploy to fool the commanders of the Red Army and to draw Soviet troops away from the real target, which he believed was Moscow. For the time being, the protection of the capital remained Stalin's priority, but while Nazi troops prepared for the advance, Hitler's true motives would soon be clear. 1 month later than planned, on June 28, 1942, Operation Blue had finally commenced, and the troops of Army Group South were thundering across the desolate Russian plains towards their objective. The Axis forces had been split into two groups. Army Group South A, which was commanded by Wilhelm List and included the 17th Army and the 1st Panzer Army, which advanced towards the Caucasus in the far south. Meanwhile, Army Group South B, which included General Hans von Salmuth's 2nd Army, the 4th Panzer Army, and General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army, marched east towards Stalingrad and the Volga River. There had been concerns amongst the Nazi commanders that the decision taken to run two operations simultaneously would put a strain on supply lines and put the entire offensive at risk. But in the early stages of the advance, Army Group B's progress towards Stalingrad went so well that Hitler decided to make some changes to the order of battle. Believing that Army Group B didn't need the 4th Panzer Army anymore, he ordered the tanks south to join the troops advancing on the Caucasus. The change in strategy resulted in a huge traffic jam as the panzers crossed the path of the motorized 6th Army, and Paulus's advance was delayed. While the 6th Army waited, the days passed by and the element of surprise evaporated. With the accumulation of traffic to the south, the Soviets now realized that the target of the next Axis attack was Stalingrad, not Moscow, and all available troops began to rush towards the city to prepare for its defense. Red Army General Andrei Yaremenko was placed in command and consolidated what forces he had on the eastern bank of the Volga to prepare for their approach. But once Army Group B was ready to advance once more, their progress was swifter than ever, and soon Paulus's 6th Army had reached the River Don, which lay only 40 miles west of Stalingrad and the Volga. Fierce fighting ensued as the Soviet soldiers in the area did all they could to check the Axis advance, but all their efforts would prove futile. By July 21st, more than 100 assault boats began crossing the Don, and within hours a beachhead had been established on its east bank. The Soviets put as many men as they could muster into the 40-mile margin which separated the Don from the Volga, but soon Russian defences were crumbling, and it appeared that little stood in the way of the Axis advance into Stalingrad itself. In a desperate attempt to stop the Soviet collapse, Stalin ordered that every granule of Russian soil be defended to the last drop of blood, threatening those who retreated with death. Meanwhile, anyone strong enough to hold a rifle was sent to defend the city, and civilians were ordered to dig trenchworks and fortifications around its outskirts. No one was exempt from the effort to save Stalingrad, and women and children worked as hard as the soldiers to prevent the Nazis seizing their city. However, by the end of August, the battle was about to become harder than ever as the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, began their attack from the skies. As the city was reduced to rubble and ruins, the Axis troops moved steadily closer, and soon the spearhead of the Sixth Army had reached a section of the Volga to the north of the city. By the beginning of September, Stalingrad was surrounded on 3 sides, and the real battle was about to commence. Two months after the offensive had begun, the city limits were finally penetrated by Paulus's troops, and Axis forces broke into the city in a dozen places. Not long after, the Nazis cut the rail line that travelled across Russia from Stalingrad to Moscow, destroying one of the country's most important supply routes. Troops and supplies could now only reach Stalingrad from across the Volga behind the city. As the situation deteriorated, Stalin ordered one of his greatest commanders, General Zhukov, to leave Moscow and head south to coordinate the defense of Stalingrad. Meanwhile, General Vasily Chukov, who had fought off the Nazi attack as they advanced across the Don, was placed in command of the Russian 62nd Army, which was now responsible for holding Stalingrad. Before long, Chukov's situation would become desperate, however, as the 62nd Army were penned into the city in the grip of the Germans. By mid-September, the Axis troops had taken the highest point in the town, an ancient Tatar burial ground known as the Mamai Tumulus, giving them a huge advantage over the Soviets. From here, they could attack strategic targets around the city, and there was little doubt that whoever controlled the high ground commanded the battle. The Soviet 13th Guard Rifle Division arrived across the Volga to reinforce the 62nd Army and were ordered to charge the strongpoint by Chukov. Few would survive the ordeal, and thousands of Soviet soldiers would die in the battle for the summit. But soon it was once more beneath Russian control, and the fighting now descended into the streets of Stalingrad. The battle would become one of the bloodiest of the Second World War, as the Axis fought the Soviets for every ruin, cellar and staircase in the city. There were no battle lines, only brutal skirmishes between one street and the next, while buildings ridden with snipers turned the area into a vast killing zone. For those fighting within, life would become an endless hell of gunfire, hunger and fear, and the casualties on both sides would be immense. While Stalin's war against the Axis continued, it was clear that a second front to take the pressure off Soviet troops could not come a moment too soon. But the invasion of North Africa, which Churchill had promised the Soviet leader, was as yet in the early planning stages, and disagreements between America and British commanders were beginning to threaten the progress of any invasion at all. Concerns at this stage revolved around where the landings in French African territory should be. Churchill wanted to land troops as close as possible to the base of Rommel's Afrika Korps and advocated landing on the eastern border of Algeria, close to Tunisia. But the American Army Chief of Staff, George C. Marshall, wanted to limit landings to western Algeria and appeared to be planning attack on a much smaller scale than Churchill had envisaged. Disconcerted, the British Prime Minister reminded Roosevelt that the Allies had promised Stalin a serious diversion to draw German efforts away from the Soviet Union, and ever the diplomat, Roosevelt ensured that a compromise was found which would please both American and British commanders. It was decided that there would be 3 simultaneous landings. American forces would land in Casablanca in Morocco, as well as Oran in Algeria, while a combined British and American force would land in Algiers, which lay further to the east of Algeria and closer to Rommel's troops. The invasion itself would, however, take time to prepare, and while US soldiers and Marines were mobilized for the attack and began arriving in Britain, ready for their first European offensive, it seemed unlikely that American forces would be ready for the invasion until the late autumn. In the meantime, American commanders had more than just the European theatre of war to contend with. Although the priority of the United States had been to defeat Nazi Germany when they had entered the war in December 1941, in the Far East, Hitler's Japanese allies were posing a considerable threat to Allied interests. During the first 6 months of the Pacific War, the Japanese had conquered hundreds of thousands of miles of territory, spanning from Burma in East Asia to the islands of the South Pacific. But by May 1942, American forces had started to make some progress in checking the Japanese advance. During the Battle of Coral Sea, they had successfully prevented the Japanese from taking further territory in New Guinea. And the following month, a major naval battle had been fought around the island of Midway in the North Pacific, which had inflicted heavy losses on the Japanese fleet. Nevertheless, the Empire of the Rising Sun showed little sign of easing their campaign to seize new territory, and by mid-1942 they were constructing a large airfield on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. From here, they could launch attacks on American bases in Fiji, New Caledonia and Samoa, and threaten Allied supplies and communication lines to Australia, which lay to the south of the Solomon Islands. While Allied concerns grew, Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, proposed an invasion of the island of Guadalcanal and other strategic points around the Solomons, and the combined Chiefs of Staff had soon agreed to launching their first American offensive in the Pacific. After spending 6 months on the defensive, the Allied counterblow was soon underway, and by late July 1942, the 1st Marine Divisions had left their training areas in New Zealand, ready for the battle. They moved north in deep secrecy, and as a cold front swept across the Pacific, they were able to use the weather as a cover. By the time they reached the Solomon Islands on August 7th, the seas were calm and and the Japanese had no idea that an attack was about to be launched. The landing force then split into two groups, with one group assaulting Guadalcanal and the other attacking Tulagi and Florida Island. At first there was little resistance from Japanese troops, who began to flee after aerial bombing from Allied planes had paved the way for the invasion, but by the second day, the battle had begun. While troops fought back on the ground, there were heavy air attacks from Japanese planes based on Bougainville and other nearby islands. But despite the bombardment, American forces had reached the Japanese airfield on the second day of the offensive. They renamed the airbase Henderson Field after a Marine who'd been killed during the Battle of Midway, and from here, the Americans could launch their own attacks on the enemy. Throughout August, US aircraft and their crews would continue to arrive at Guadalcanal to beat back the enemy, and air battles between the Allied aircraft at Henderson Airfield and Japanese bombers and fighters from Rabaul in New Guinea continued daily. While the Japanese commander defending the island ordered his troops to rout and annihilate the enemy, the battles through the dense and disease-ridden jungles of Guadalcanal would be some of the worst the American GIs would encounter during the Second World War. In the meantime, 800 miles to the west, there was an equally difficult conflict underway, coordinated by Supreme Allied Commander of the Southwest Pacific Area, General Douglas MacArthur. It had been decided that the invasion of Guadalcanal would be carried out at the same time as an Allied offensive in New Guinea, where the Japanese were threatening to seize territory once more. Lessons had been learnt at the Battle of Coral Sea, and rather than launching an amphibious invasion, this time the Japanese decided to mount an overland assault across the towering Owen Stanley Mountains in late July. Their target was a strategic town on New Guinea's southern coast by the name of Port Moresby, and from here they could launch further attacks on the northeast of Australia. The Japanese had already inflicted severe bombardments on Australia, and MacArthur, who was renowned for his determination, decided to launch a bold counter-offensive which would ensure the country was protected from further attacks. If the Japanese dared to venture across the Owen Stanley Mountains, so would the Allies, and MacArthur ordered the battle-hardened troops of the Australian 7th Division, who had returned from fighting Rommel's troops in Africa earlier in the year, to venture deep into the jungle to beat back the Japanese invaders. The track they followed was the Kokoda Trail, or track, and it would take them through some of the most hazardous terrain in the South Pacific. Through disease-ridden swamps, plunging gorges, and dark, humid jungles, the Australians embarked on a deadly mission to fight back the Japanese. There was little opportunity for rest, while they remained on constant alert for the enemy both day and night. In the meantime, US planes flew overhead to drop supplies to the troops battling on the ground, though the smoke signals the Australians sent out would not always be easy to find. Fortunately, the native people of New Guinea would play a vital part in the Kokoda Track campaign, looking after supplies for the troops when they were dropped in the local villages and taking care of the soldiers when they were injured. While the campaigns in the Solomons and New Guinea continued into the autumn of 1942, it was clear that the battles to vanquish the Japanese were yet in the early stages. And as Australian and American troops attempted to wrench territory from the enemy's grasp inch by inch, it was evident that the war in the Pacific would be a long and bitter conflict. In Africa and the Mediterranean, there was, however, already a glimmer of hope on the horizon as the battle continued against German and Italian forces. In August, an operation had been launched to get supplies through to those desperately struggling on Malta, and 14 merchant ships had set off from Gibraltar, protected by 2 large forces of warships. Throughout the voyage, Allied forces suffered heavy bombardments from Axis planes, and many of the Allied ships, including destroyers, carriers, and the merchant ships themselves, were sunk or badly damaged during the voyage to Malta. Nevertheless, by August 15th, 5 merchant ships had managed to reach the island, and although the siege of Malta had by no means come to an end, the supplies that they brought meant that for the time being, the island could continue to fight back, and the Axis conquest of the Mediterranean was not yet complete. Meanwhile, in Africa, the morale of Allied troops protecting Egypt had been lifted considerably by the presence of General Montgomery. After he'd taken command of the 8th Army on August 13th, he became a whirlwind of activity, regularly appearing before the troops and announcing to his officers, "If we are attacked, then there will be no retreat. If we cannot stay here alive, then we will stay here dead." At the end of August, Rommel made a last and desperate bid to reach the Nile, but proving he was a man of his word, Montgomery checked the Nazi advance in 2 days' fighting in the Battle of Alam el Halfa. From this moment onwards, Montgomery's focus would be on the preparation for a counterattack, which he was determined would lead to a decisive victory against Rommel's forces. The British commander decided to move his field headquarters closer to the Air Force command post in order to better coordinate combined operations, so the Army, Navy and Air Forces could fight their battles in a unified, focused manner. His aim was to deny Rommel the strength to withstand the 8th Army when they launched their counterattack, and he ordered the Allied Air Force to destroy every enemy strip they could find in the eastern Mediterranean, as well as bombing the sea routes to Rommel's front. The British commander also focused airstrikes on enemy ports in North Africa, so if supplies did make it through, they would find it virtually impossible to unload the ships when they arrived. Meanwhile, from Benghazi to Al Alamein, there were regular bombardments of Rommel's troops. The combined effort had the desired result, and within a month, less than half of Rommel's supplies would be getting through. Soon the tables would be turned in North Africa, and while preparations continued for the invasion of Northwest Africa before long, the Axis would be facing an attack on 2 fronts. Rommel knew full well that the British Commonwealth forces would soon be strong enough to launch an offensive against his army, and his only hope now was that the German forces fighting in the Battle of Stalingrad could swiftly defeat the Soviet troops. The Germans advancing through the Caucasus could then threaten Iran and the Middle East and draw British troops away from his front line. But Rommel's hopes would all be in vain, for in Stalingrad, the Russians were planning a momentous counterattack, and as the winter of 1942 drew near, the tides of war were about to turn.